Useless Monster by Mute Crows. Chapter 16, or Chapter 15. The sun had barely risen, and Yagi was already walking quickly down the stairs to the streets below his apartment. The night had been near painfully long. He wanted to get to the school as soon as he could. He entered the medical wing and passed Shujine on his way into the room Izuku was being kept in. Blood King was waiting outside the door, eyes closed. No words were exchanged between any of them. Izuku was smaller, not his normal size, but not the massive beast of a creature that he had been when Yagi had broken into the building the day before. The spurs on his muzzle were gone, as were the fins, skin reattached with sparse stitches along their seams. He circled around Izuku anxiously. The ribs were now barely poking out of his vents, which looked much less irritated. Each of the monitors around the room had readings outside of what would be a healthy range for a human, but they were steady. Body temperature too high, breathing and heart rate too low, blood pressure just strange. He wasn't sure what the rest of all the many machines checked to be able to read them. He settled onto a stool that was probably Shuzenji's and waited. And waited. And waited more. He watched the staff of UA come and go. Heroes approached or passed the room cautiously, even with Izuku sleeping. It was a subtle caution, but it still made Yagi's skin itch in frustration. He understood that they had no real experience with Izuku, and any situation with large quirk users must be dealt with carefully, but it felt wrong. His confidence that there would be no issues was held with the same weight as a grain of sand. He just wanted Izuku to wake up. It was still yet to pass the 24-hour mark for his sedated state, sure, but the time felt like it was dragging by. He sighed, feeling an ache in his bones that he had failed in ways he didn't really understand yet. The ribs had receded entirely. It was around noon when Shuzenji walked into the room again.
"You need to eat and recover too, All Might."
She didn't look his way as she checked the monitors, logging things she deemed important on her phone's notepad.
Nope. You don't get to set bad examples. Even if your student is asleep at the moment, you need to continue to set the standard you want him to match. You would want him to eat and recover if he was in your position, yes?
She put away her phone and checked the fluid drips.
Then go eat. You will be called if he wakes up.
He knew she was right. He would make it quick. Well, as quick as he could, since he was sure Nezu would probably try to find him to talk about everything again. The principal was a fiend when it came to information. His eyes flew open, body tensed, breath stopped. He looked around the empty room. Medical. He could hear the beeping of the machines attached to him. Izuku let out his breath as silently as possible, slid his head along the linoleum, and spotted 3 ectoplasm clones standing in front of the one door to the room. Wait. His breathing hitched as it sped up, fear rising. The clones weren't there when he had fallen asleep, just Yagi and Recovery Girl. No, I need to get out. Izuku's claws scraped on the floor, and all 3 clones turned to face him directly. He hurried to his feet. He was back to normal, it seemed size-wise, and he accidentally knocked over the stand that had been holding up his fluids. It clattered loudly, and he jumped in response to the sudden noise. He was hyperventilating. Whoa there. Settle down. One of the clones spoke as all 3 approached him, hands up to try and calm him. Trying to detain, to subdue. They're keeping me here. Izuku backed up, stumbling over himself and warbling in distress. He couldn't get his words to cooperate with how hard he was breathing. He didn't want to be caught. He didn't want to be kept here. He only just got to where he could begin his life. His jaw worked as he tried to get his words to go, even as the clones hushed him, and he continued to back away. His heel hit the wall, and he simply angled himself to back along the wall. It wasn't long before he hit the corner of the room. Trapped, the attempted soothing was doing nothing for him, as his brain was on full alert. Tears started to fall down his face as he curled over himself, packing himself into the corner as best he could. The tugging on his limbs had him looking down to see that he had dragged his fluids along, the bags adding uncomfortable weight to the needles he initially failed to notice were inserted below his skin. He didn't understand. He didn't know what all these things were specifically for, and it was terrifying. He didn't know what they did while he was asleep, or what was planned for him. His warbling became near yowling as he cried harder. The hushes and other vague sounds from the clones were starting to add to his panic, so he covered them with his own noises. One of the clones was talking to another, and they didn't seem to regard him as fully sentient. Not to his eyes, at least. He wasn't some animal. He just wanted to know what was happening. His legs felt so heavy, and he didn't know if it was because of the things that were in his skin or because of the villain attack. He didn't even know how long he had been asleep. A clone was talking into some device. He's getting more people. He tried talking again through the shaking breaths and his sobs. Yagi! Izuku practically shouted it at the clones. He hiccuped as he dropped his head to the floor, eyes closed. Yagi! He broke down there on the floor, repeating the name over and over. Yagi would help him. Yagi would save him. Please. Yagi! Stumbling footsteps echoed down the hall, and Izuku felt the aches he was searching for. Yagi came into view, panting from the run to Izuku. Two of the clones turned to the hero, and Izuku's heart stuttered in a torrent of conflicting emotions.
Izuku, wait!
The clones all got barreled over as Izuku broke past them. His hands grasped at Yagi like he would vanish the moment his grip slipped. He wrapped himself as close as he could to him and cried harder. Yagi's arms came up around his neck and held on firmly, comfortingly. He ran a hand through Izuku's fur, and each pass had Izuku slowly catching his breath. It took a moment for his breathing to settle to a more reasonable speed. I'm sorry. I don't know what I did. That I'm here. Izuku slurred, the side of his head pressed to Yagi's back. Please, don't leave me here. I'm sorry. Yagi's fingers dug into his shoulders. Izuku felt how his shaking and tired legs started to slide on the floor and did his best to sit in a way that wouldn't hurt Yagi. His mentor let himself drop into a sitting position as well.
Just lie down, my boy. I'm not leaving you here.
Yagi spoke softly. But you already did. Izuku pushed away the sour thought and held on. He came back, though. The sound of the clones approaching made his whole body tense. He was afraid, but didn't know how to say it. Not directly. He didn't know what was going to happen next, and he was desperate for any sense of clarity on anything. He felt Yagi shake his head, and their approach stopped.
How long does he have to stay here?
Yagi spoke softly. Proximity made Izuku's antenna twitch. There was silence for a moment before Izuku heard tapping, and then what would have otherwise been a muffled ring. Your patient is awake, ma'am. There wasn't even a response as the line cut. Recovery girl will be here shortly. The clones made no motion to move, simply standing where they were, watching. Yagi patted Izuku gently.
Do you mind if we adjust, my boy? This can't be all that comfortable of a position for you.
Izuku didn't realize until he felt the pricks of pain on Yagi that his grip had tightened. He dropped his hands immediately, pulling the small pierced prince away. Sorry. He kept his head hidden behind Yagi.
There's nothing to worry about.
Izuku watched the tiles, trying to both calmly and forcefully relax because he just wanted his heart to settle at this point. Yagi was still running hands over his fur. It helped more than he expected. He was still confused about a number of things, though. Today? He asked after a minute or so.
The attack was yesterday, my boy.
The fact that so much of his body was patched up already was jarring in that context. Then again, they did call for a recovery girl, so it was likely that she had healed him in parts and places as well. It wasn't like he was fully healed at the moment either. Class?
School is on hold at the moment. You were the only one really hurt in your class, although you really gave young Asui quite the scare, Izuku. She wasn't expecting you to suddenly change like that. She told the officer she thought it was some quirk used on you.
Izuku whined softly. He wasn't trying to scare people, but he hadn't been able to think of anything else he could do at that moment.
Don't fret too much. This is just something you two will have to discuss when you next have the chance.
He patted him twice before returning to the gentle drag of fingers through fur.
Both Eraserhead and 13 were admitted here along with you.
There was so much. Izuku remembered how it just felt like too much. There was red everywhere. The door slid open and Recovery Girl entered in a huff.
Did you eat like I said, All Might?
She walked past the both of them and picked up the rack that had been holding the fluid bags elevated, standing it up next to Izuku.
Put the bags back on the rack for me, please, Ectoplasm.
Yes.
Yagi didn't move, but he was watching Recovery Girl briskly walk around the room, adjusting things that Izuku had knocked over from the sound of it.
Is this more like how he usually looks? From my understanding, you have experience with this form.
She was coming closer, stopping just out of sight.
It is. He can talk.
His second sentence felt pointed. Izuku pressed his antenna flat. She hummed as she circled around and looked over his face. She carefully lifted one of his forehands, checking the IV that had been jostled in his panic.
Are you feeling strange at all, Midoriya?
She walked to a cabinet along one of the walls he could see, pulled out a bandage, and returned. Legs feel heavy and foggy. He watched as she firmly secured, with a sure and gentle hand, the IV in place with a bandage.
That would be the exhaustion and some of the medications I gave you over the night. Anything else?
She set the leftover bandage length to the side and gestured to something behind him. Her soft but clinical tone had him on edge, as he wasn't sure how much was a fabrication to try and calm him. He tensed slightly until one of the clones brought Recovery Girl's chair over and she took a seat. She pulled out a memo pad from her coat pocket and settled back.
No. Good. You will have to stay here another night to ensure you are healed properly. Will that be okay?
Yeah. He felt trapped. He didn't really have a say in it, and he knew that much.
I have a few questions for you. We can stop if you need to after a bit, but this is information I will need to know for future reference. This form of yours runs much differently than your usual one.
She pulled the syringe from her hair and clicked the plunger, revealing the fact that it was actually a pen. He nodded in understanding, adjusting around Yagi so that he was more circled around him than draped over him.
Do you feel unusually warm? In a feverish sense? Anything unusual that you know isn't from an injury or the medications I just mentioned?
He shook his head. She wrote something down quickly.
How much do you remember from the events that caused you to change?
She looked him in the eyes as she spoke, at least as best as one could. It made him feel oddly scrutinized. A lot. My head got blurry when, Nomu hurt me a lot. His words were warbling heavily again. He huffed softly. Yagi ran a hand over his side.
Do you remember getting here?
He shook his head, feeling ashamed in a way that he didn't. He knew he had been awake for it, but he just couldn't remember.
That's okay. Cementos and some of the faculty moved you here.
She wrote some other things.
Do you have any medical understanding of this form?
Not really.
Do you mind if I record some things about this form so that I have a base to work with if I ever need to handle this form again? When you are healed.
Izuku tensed slightly. He had to trust her even with his fears of getting treated as an experiment.
It would be good to have simple tests run to have a better understanding of how to treat you if you end up stuck in this form again, Izuku.
Yagi whispered.
I could be there the whole time, if it would make it easier for you.
He thought about it a moment. It would be for the best. Okay. Later.
Of course. Like I said, you would need to be fully healed for the exam.
She wrote down a few more lines of notes and put the pen back in her bun. The memo pad got tucked back into its pocket. He twisted his head quickly at the sound of more steps approaching the room, antenna lifting slightly. President Mike slid open the door with a slight flare and paused, seemingly thrown by the sight of Izuku wrapped around Yagi on the floor a little ways away and Recovery Girl on a seat right next to them. So, shoulders awake? He wants to know when the soonest he can go home is? He pulled his gaze off of Izuku directly and looked at Recovery Girl. She sighed, sliding off the seat and straightening her coat.
That man needs to learn to use the brakes during recovery. A lot of you could use the lesson as well.
She started to walk past Izuku, and he turned, staring up a bit. I can... He started to say, knowing his shortcoming was the reason he got injured so badly in the first place.
Absolutely not.
Recovery Girl didn't even look as she continued towards Mike. Izuku unwrapped from around Yagi and started to walk after her. But... He stumbled slightly with a slight huff. There was a strange sense of squishiness to his heavy legs, as if his legs were in sludge.
Listen to the doctor, kiddo. Shona is just cranky.
Mike gave him a two-finger salute and disappeared from the doorway. Is that right, my boy? You need to heal before you start trying to take anything else.
Yagi was standing next to him again, hand now apparently a permanent resident on his fur.
Ma'am?
Recovery Girl stopped with her hand on the door.
Do I need these needles and stuff still? I don't like how it makes me feel.
He sat hunched slightly and lowered his head nervously.
I don't know what they will do if I change back with them in.
She considered him for a moment before nodding.
I'm trusting you to know your abilities well enough in this form. If things start feeling wrong, you need to tell me or tell the staff to contact me. The IV has been giving you fluid so far, but you need to eat as soon as possible.
She made her way back and undid the fresh bandage she had secured the IV with moments ago. It had Izuku feeling mildly guilty. It was a waste of bandage. He could distantly feel it get removed.
Thank you.
Izuku looked at his hand pointedly. The fur was ruffled where the IV had been. Yagi softly urged him to lie down and rest. Somehow the fact that he was being made to stay in a single room instead of deciding to himself made the time feel so much longer. Even with the comfort of Yagi being there, he was restless in his own skin. The slow descent of the sun felt like it was yanking out his feathers in its tedium. The sun set and Izuku had settled with his jaw on his knee, gazed blankly out the window. He wasn't really watching the sky, but he was looking that way as he sorted his current state in his mind. His legs no longer felt heavy, and his only sore spots were muscles. The elbow he had healed on Aizawa was stiff, but it no longer felt flaked, just naked. The fur wouldn't be so quick to return. At some point, Recovery Girl came back and instructed Yagi to go home and rest. The man had very reluctantly left only after promising to be back first thing in the morning. He warbled in acknowledgement as he watched him leave. Ectoplasm and his clones stepped out of the room with Yagi. The lights in the room dimmed under the pretense that Izuku would be sleeping soon after. He closed his eyes. The possibility of getting distracted was something he was determined to avoid. Carefully, he grasped at his form. His grip kept slipping from an edge smoothed over. It was different. He didn't like that it was different. This form was supposed to be something he had under control by now. His brow furrowed slightly as he tried to focus more on getting his grip secure. The change back was both expected and sudden. It felt like a misstep. Something felt incomplete and unhealed, as if put on a metaphorical back burner. Yet he didn't know what it was. He sat up and looked at himself. His gym uniform was ruined. It was torn in some areas and blood was all over it. A deep breath. He took off his gloves and set them on the floor, stretched as he cracked and popped in multiple places. Then he was standing, hopping experimentally from foot to foot. His legs felt fine now. No signs of that liquid weight left from the medications. Izuku searched around with his quirk. He couldn't feel ectoplasm or his clones, but he knew they hadn't left their positions outside his door. It wasn't much further down to find the muffled aches and pains of medically subdued injuries. He walked silently to the door, keeping his steps light, and rests his hand on the handle. He just needed to see them and know. That's all. A moment more to orient himself on the path he would need to take, and he slung open the door. Ectoplasm had apparently downsized to just one clone as the both whipped to face the door that Izuku dashed out of, their shouts left hanging as he ran. He stumbled as he tried to slide to a stop at the door he was aiming for. It was already open, which on one hand was helpful, but on the other he had unintentionally slammed into the doorframe. A pained wheeze was pushed out of him as he lowered into a crouch. Two sets of hands pulled him to his feet again.
Midoriya, you shouldn't even be on your feet yet. You only just recently were able to change back to normal from whatever creature you have previously been.
Ectoplasm's scolding stung in a way he was sure the hero wasn't intending. A creature. He wasn't wrong, but it hurt to have it thrown at him in such a way. I just need to see them. I need to. Izuku pulled at their grip as he looked around the room. Aizawa was swaddled in bandages everywhere visible and likely below the blankets as well. Guilt prickled over him even as he saw the steady rise and fall of his chest. Sleeping. The other bed had a light on next to it as 13 was sat up and reading files, probably incident reports. They were also wrapped in bandages, but in a way that focused on their back. Starry eyes flitted to focus on him with visible confusion. Izuku hadn't even thought as he reached out with the oddly intense internal pull that he recognized as his quirk after a missed beat. The grip on the aches of the two heroes jolted strangely, and his knees buckled as the sharp addition of pain unmedicated hit him full force. Ectoplasm's continued hold on him was the only thing that kept him from falling. He bit down a small whimper. The amount of medication the two were under was more than Izuku had assumed. Whatever wasn't sitting right in him was making the pain feel worse. 13 spilled worry and surprise in a strange, choked gasp at Izuku nearly dropping by taking some of their pain. Is he okay? 13 asked as they set aside their reports and sat up more tentatively. Yeah, Izuku answered before Ectoplasm could. We'll be going back to Midoriya's room now. Have a good night, 13. Ectoplasm said calmly before he and his clone pointedly started walking Izuku out of the room. They both kept at least one hand on Izuku the whole time. It wasn't a point, really. He was feeling even more exhausted than before. Once they had reached his room, Ectoplasm created a new clone that crossed into the room across the hall. He was guided into the room, and they stood near the windows as the newest clone entered with a medical cot on wheels. There was a change of clothes that weren't his set on the bed, as the clone moved the cot into place next to Izuku. Change out of your gym uniform. There's a shower stall in the restroom as well. All Might had said to be sure the room had one nearby or attached. Ectoplasm picked up the clothes and offered them to him. He carefully took them and looked at the door he was pointed to. You will need a rest afterwards. We will be in the room for the night. The point was made clear. They now saw him as a running risk. He didn't argue. In the bathroom, he had to peel the gym uniform off his skin. Blood had dried in such a way that it had melted to him somewhat. He didn't spend long in the shower, just long enough to get the blood off of him with some scrubbing. The warmth of the shower only made him more aware of how tired he was for many reasons. He toweled off quickly, dressed in the clothes one size too large, and stood in the bathroom for a moment. He needed a minute to breathe. Thankfully, Ectoplasm and his clones allowed it. He walked out with his beaten-up gym clothes in hand, along with the towel. Where do I put this? He asked as he looked around again. He had not seen a bin in the bathroom for dirty things, and the rest of the room was rather empty overall. One of the clones approached him and wordlessly offered to take them. When Izuku hesitated, Ectoplasm spoke up from a seat near the cot. The school will provide you with a new uniform. The damage from the villain attack could not have been expected. Oh! Izuku set the clothes in the clone's hands and watched as he promptly turned and left the room. He watched the door close and made his way to the cot. Once settled, the room became quiet in an off way. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't tense or uncomfortable either. It just held a certain energy that Izuku could only assume was ectoplasm, and the remaining clone being subtly prepared to react if he tried to escape again. Izuku felt like it took an absurd amount of time to fall asleep as a result. Static itches lit up his skin in restlessness. There was a nervous energy like he messed up something in the past few days. Something was changing, and he had no way to know how prepared he was for said change. He really hoped he could actually leave the next morning.